Selecting the research design begins only after the research problem and the literature gap have been fully articulated, because a design is not something chosen on preference or familiarity. It is revealed by the study's own logic. A design becomes clear only when the researcher understands precisely what kind of knowledge the field is missing. The research problem identifies a real phenomenon, brings forward a tension within that phenomenon, and names a consequence that matters if the tension remains unresolved. Once this problem is established, the literature gap then identifies what prior scholarship has not yet explained, tested, or understood about that tension. When those two pieces are viewed together, they show the type of knowledge the field now needs: interpretive, numerical, or both. The design is simply the method capable of producing that form of knowledge. This is why the design cannot come first. When a design is selected prematurely, the study feels stretched or misaligned, because the method was chosen before the researcher understood what the study actually needed to know. When the design is chosen after the problem and the gap, the method feels inevitable, because the problem's logic has already defined the type of knowledge the study must produce. A research problem begins with a phenomenon, an observable pattern, practice, or condition occurring in a real educational context. Inside that phenomenon lies a tension, something that is not working, misaligned, unclear, or underexamined. The problem then extends to a consequence that explains why that tension matters at the levels of students, educators, systems, or outcomes. The literature gap sits directly within that tension. It reveals what the field does not yet understand about the phenomenon, and it pinpoints the unresolved intellectual or practical puzzle. When the phenomenon, the tension, the consequence, and the gap are placed together, they reveal whether the study requires conceptual knowledge that clarifies meaning and experience, empirical knowledge that clarifies patterns and relationships, or dual knowledge that clarifies both pattern and mechanism. This is where design emerges. Suppose the missing knowledge requires understanding experience, meaning, interpretation, identity, emotion, perspective, or internal processes. In that case, qualitative inquiry becomes necessary, as only qualitative work can illuminate how people navigate, interpret, and make sense of a phenomenon. Suppose the missing knowledge requires measurable evidence of patterns, differences, predictors, or relationships among defined variables. In that case, then quantitative inquiry becomes necessary, as only quantitative methods can test, model, and quantify those relationships. Suppose the missing knowledge has two layers: a pattern that can be measured and a mechanism that must be understood. Then mixed methods inquiry becomes necessary, as only a combined design can hold both empirical and interpretive forms of knowledge at once. The sequence always flows in one direction. A phenomenon is observed, a tension is identified within it, a consequence shows why that tension matters. The literature gap reveals what the field still does not know about the tension. That gap highlights the type of missing knowledge, and the design follows as the method capable of generating that missing knowledge. This is not a procedural detail, but the structural foundation of a coherent study. When a design is chosen after this sequence, the alignment between the problem, the gap, and the method is unmistakable. The study feels logically grounded because each part directly shapes the next. When a design is chosen before this sequence, the study feels forced or falls apart because the researcher does not yet know whether the field needs depth, measurement, or both. Every design choice arises from the same conceptual core. The research problem reveals a tension that matters, the literature gap shows the unresolved dimension of that tension, and together they indicate the form of knowledge that must be produced. The design is the methodological expression of that form. It takes the shape already implied by the problem itself. This is why, in well-structured research, the design is not merely selected, it is discovered. A qualitative design becomes necessary when the type of knowledge missing in the field is conceptual rather than numerical. In these situations, the phenomenon itself may be visible, but its internal dynamics remain unclear. The researcher may know that something is happening. Teachers are overwhelmed, students disengage, adults struggle with new tools, leaders respond inconsistently, but the field does not yet understand how these events are experienced from the inside. Qualitative inquiry is required when the central questions involve interpretation, meaning, perception, story, identity, or sense-making. In these studies, the constructs that matter are lived rather than measured. They unfold in language, emotion, cognition, and relationship. A qualitative design is also required when the field does not yet know enough about a phenomenon to define variables. Attempts to quantify would be premature, because the dimensions of the experience have not been identified. In this special case, qualitative inquiry is not merely appropriate. It is essential. It provides initial conceptual clarity that later enables measurement. Without this foundation, quantitative work would rely on artificial or incomplete operational definitions that do not reflect real experience. Qualitative designs such as phenomenology, narrative inquiry, case study, and grounded theory allow researchers to capture these interpretive dimensions and reveal what matters most before anyone attempts to quantify the phenomenon. A quantitative design is necessary when the missing knowledge is empirical, when the constructs are well enough defined to be measured and the study seeks to identify patterns, differences, relationships, or predictors. In these cases, the research problem centers on questions about magnitude, direction, or statistical association. The field may know what the relevant variables are, but lack evidence about how they behave in relation to one another. When schools introduce a new intervention, expand tutoring, implement a digital tool, or reorganize instructional structures, the unresolved question may concern effects or outcomes rather than interpretations. A quantitative design becomes appropriate when the gap reveals that prior studies have described a phenomenon, but have not yet measured it, modeled it, or tested causal or correlational relationships. Here, the missing knowledge is not about meaning, it is about empirical verification. Quantitative approaches allow researchers to determine whether patterns exist, how strong those patterns are, whether differences between groups are significant, and whether certain conditions predict specific outcomes. In such studies, meaning need not be uncovered through interpretation, as the literature has already shaped the constructs. What is missing is numerical evidence. A mixed methods design becomes necessary when the missing knowledge is dual, when part of the tension in the research problem is empirical and another part is conceptual. This occurs when there is a measurable pattern that cannot be understood without exploring the mechanisms that produce it. It also occurs when rich experiential insights need to be examined in relation to broader trends or measurable outcomes. Mixed methods inquiry is not used because it feels balanced or thorough. It is used because the logic of the problem demands two kinds of knowledge that no single methodology can provide. If a pattern is observable but the reasons behind that pattern remain unclear, quantitative work alone cannot resolve the tension. If experience provides insight but the field does not know how widespread that experience is, or how it connects to outcomes, qualitative work alone is insufficient. Mixed methods designs connect meaning with measurement, mechanism with pattern, and interpretation with empirical evidence. When the problem and gap require both forms of knowledge in order to be fully addressed, mixed methods becomes the only design that fits. Taken together, these ideas form the backbone of methodological alignment. A research design is never an early decision or a stylistic choice. It is the product of understanding the phenomenon, naming the tension within it, identifying what is at stake if that tension persists, and recognizing precisely what the field still does not know. Once the research problem and the literature gap are fully developed, the design ceases to feel optional. The method becomes the only coherent response to the puzzle the study has surfaced. Qualitative inquiry is required when meaning, experience, or conceptual clarity sit at the center of the tension. Quantitative inquiry is required when the missing knowledge concerns patterns, effects, or relationships among established variables. Mixed methods inquiry is required when measurement alone cannot explain the phenomenon, and interpretation alone cannot account for variations in outcomes. Each design emerges not from preference but from the study's logic. At this point, the role of research design shifts from a methodological label to a justification grounded in the problem's internal structure. The question is no longer, which approach do I want to use? But instead, what form of knowledge must this study produce? and what method can make it with integrity. With that clarity in place, the study takes on coherence, and the design becomes the natural extension of the problem and gap that preceded it. This foundation lays the groundwork for examining how these principles take shape in actual research contexts.